Welcome to the studio. I want to ask you a question. Think about the last thing you almost bought but didn't. Think about it. Pause. The last thing you thought about buying? Would it have been your phone, a new tablet, a new laptop, some widget, some piece of furniture? But think about the last time you almost bought it, but you didn't. You didn't buy that product, you bought somebody else's. You picked it up, you looked at it, you put it back down. You had a reason for choosing one item over its competitors, and only you know exactly what it was that caused you to make that decision. Did anybody ever ask you why you didn't choose the losing product? Of course not. And somebody did the same thing to you this week. Something you made or you wrote or suggested, maybe an idea you put into a meeting that got a polite nod and then went nowhere. They considered it, decided against it, and you never find out the real reason why it never got traction. Almost everything that comes back to you comes from people who said yes. Inside a business, that machinery makes that official. Satisfaction surveys go to people who purchased your products. Reviews come from people who have bought it and used it. The customer list is a list of customers who bought your product. The one who put it back down is invisible to you and everybody else. And that person is holding maybe the key answer that you need. So, where do you point a question to reach somebody who is not there? Last week, we took a question apart and rebuilt it. But a well-made question aimed at the wrong thing comes back empty. Where you point a question is the other half of the question skill. So, let's talk about the killer questions. What is a killer question? A killer question is one that has been tested and proven to spark ideas beyond the obvious. Now, the name comes from an old phrase, the old term of killer app, where killer meant standout, unbelievable, insightful, transformative, not the lethal term. Now, I built this collection of questions the slow way. I designed a structured test into my innovation workshops, which I was running. I ran specific questions put to very specific groups, and I kept a record of what each question produced. Now, the rule for keeping a question on the list of killer questions was that it had to trigger something in that room. Did somebody walk out seeing their customer, their product, or the way they worked differently than when they walked in? If nothing moved, the question got cut. If there was a good idea underneath one, and I had simply just worded the question badly, I rewrote it and ran it again in another workshop. There are hundreds of questions. I mean, I've got stacks of the original ones. I've got the killer question card deck on desks and tables all over. I constantly use them, and I've inserted brand new ones. But the fact is most did not survive. 42 did. When I sorted the survivors, they fell into three groups, not by subject, but where they aim your thinking. Every question in the deck points in one of three things: who, what, and how. What do I mean by this? Who? Who benefits? What creates the value? And how does it get built and delivered? So think about this in more detail. Who is the person or the organization who will benefit from what you make? It's usually your customer, though the gap between usually and always where a lot of new business hides. What? What is the product, the service, the solution that creates the value for the who? Your customer. How? is the way your organization builds, delivers, and supports the what, your product or service, for the who, your customers, your key stakeholders. So, how do you do it? What are you delivering to them that's value? And who are you aiming it at? 3 places an idea can come from, and the questions exist to send you into each one on purpose rather than just doing the accidental stumbling. The cards will all say product. Read that as whatever you make for somebody else. A service counts. So does a proposal you're handing to your boss. Okay? You got that? Now, how do the card decks break down? Well, there are 13 of my cards aimed at who, 13 at what, 16 at how. Now, that split was never planned. I didn't set a target number. It is where the questions that kept surviving simply pointed. The questions that generated the best ideas that ultimately became the best innovations. And eventually, I just stopped arguing with the way they broke down. So, let's talk about the who questions. Now, in this case, the actual physical cards, I've pulled out 3 cards that we're going to walk through right now. So, the first one is who, and it's actually who question number 3. What are your unshakable beliefs about what your customers want? What are your unshakable beliefs about what your customers want? Think about that. Let me tell you a little story. The phone companies believed their customers wanted reliability above everything else. And they were right. For a century, the telephone companies built their networks towards a 99.999% uptime. 5 nines, we call it in the industry. So, a dial tone that worked in a storm, worked in an entire power failure of the electric grid serving a community. It just always worked. But then somebody turned that belief over. Is it really a belief? They asked themselves, they looked at it with no assumptions about what the customer wanted. Were there people who would give up call quality for something else? That is the question that led to voice over IP, a phone call carried over the internet. Now, in the early days of voice over IP, it sounded terrible. Calls were dropped. But the standard of the old industry had spent a century perfecting VoIP, voice over IP, was not a serious product. But underneath it, it sat on an idea that nobody in that industry had allowed themselves to consider. That many people would trade call quality, particularly as people call less and less and less, for price and mobility. You didn't have to use that old phone attached to the wall in your kitchen. And they would do so happily. And they did. That market opportunity existed before anyone built it. There was always just this assumption that all customers want that 5.9 reliability. And this is a perfect example where they're just waiting for someone willing to challenge the old standard. Go after what people had believed in the past. Okay? So that's an example. Who question? What are the unshakable beliefs about what your customers want? Next up, we're going to do a what question. So in this case, it's what question number 9. What is surprisingly inconvenient about my product? What is surprisingly inconvenient about my product? So, this is not about asking whether the product is good. Now, your team will defend that all day, and they'll be partly right, which will only make the conversation worse. Surprisingly inconvenient means some part of using your product that nobody inside your company has ever seen a real person struggle with. the 15 minutes with the instructions, the step everybody on your team skips automatically because they built the thing. On the backside of that card sits a set of short, useful questions. These are what we call sparking questions. So in front of the card is the full question. On the back are these sparking questions. And one of the interesting sparking questions is, on this particular card, do you use your own product yourself? Do you use your own product yourself? Hold on to that for a second, because in a few minutes, it turns up at Best Buy. And the strange part is that I wasn't aiming at it when I found it. Now, in this case, when people are stumbling and using your product, you've got to get up out of your chair and go observe. You can't survey for it. You can't really run focus groups for it. I haven't been able to find really good input from those. You got to get up and you got to put eyeballs on customers and see what is really going on. So let's move on to a how question. This is how question number 12. And how question number 12 is, what do people not like about the buying experience for my product? What do people not like about the buying experience for my product? Now, for the whole time I was CTO at HP, I spent nearly every Saturday in a Best Buy, or way back in the day, it would be Circuit City, you know. Now, while traveling, I would find local electronic stores in whatever country I was in, London, Frankfurt, Tokyo, and go in. Now, I wasn't shopping. I was standing in the aisle watching strangers choose. Because this question has no other answer. You can't survey somebody who did not buy your product. Now, this drove my family nuts. My family would call it my digital stalking. My kids would have done almost anything else rather than be seen with me in a Best Buy or Circuit City on a Saturday. Now, when somebody picked up a competitor's product and headed for the checkout, I would walk over, introduce myself, hand them my business card. It tended to freak them out, and ask, I'm not here to change your mind, but what made you choose that product over that product? Now, I would get crazy answers, and I would get great insight. For instance, in the case of Best Buy, those little cards that sit next to the product, the order and the wording on those cards, critically important to influence a consumer to buy your product over your competitors. And we uncovered all of this through these Saturday exercises of standing in Best Buy. Now, I did it long enough that the sales staff around Silicon Valley, all the Best Buys in the Valley, they knew me. The managers knew me. And they actually would change how they talked to a customer if they saw me standing in there on a Saturday. This was a key insight for me. So if you stay somewhere long enough, if I'm standing there every Saturday, and you suddenly stop being an observer, because if you being there and the fact that the sales staff acts differently, you influence what you're measuring. So you've got to continually change. Now, let me tell you one specific example and a major insight that happened in this process. It was a Saturday that fundamentally changed laptops at HP. A customer sat down an HP laptop and bought a competitor's. I'm not going to name the competitor. Now, I walk up and I ask them why. You were looking at this HP product, but you chose the competitor's product. Why? The customer looked me right in the eye and says, I couldn't see the keys. I couldn't see the keys on the keyboard. I'm like, I was really perplexed. And I went over and looked at the laptop. This was during the stretch when every laptop was going aluminum. All aluminum, that silver look to it, metal, right? And somebody in the laptop group had given ours even a chrome-looking keyboard so that the keyboard deck, the flat area, always had this really nice, sharp looking aluminum look to it. The problem was that keyboard was high gloss. On a store shelf, it looked expensive, which is exactly what it was designed to do. It also meant that anyone whose eyesight had started to go could not read the letters on the keyboard. I went back and looked. Sales on that product had been running under plan, and nothing in the data was telling us why. We changed the keyboard back to the matte black with high contrast white lettering on it, and sales went up on that one change. No survey would have revealed the issue, because how do you find the person who looked at it, couldn't see the keyboard, chose a competitor, and walked out the door? How do you find that person? You don't. You have to be in that moment at the time they're making the decision. Now, by the time this particular customer had even told me, he was already somebody else's customer. Notice what that question actually turned up. I went into the store carrying a how question about the buying experience. I came back with a what answer, right? And surprisingly, about what's being inconvenient about the product. What is surprisingly inconvenient? In this case, you can't read the keyboard. You choose where you aim the question based on whether you choose a who, a what, or a how question. You do not get to choose where the answer comes from. You have to be open to wherever those questions lead you. Now, how do you test for great questions? Because not all these questions are going to work in every project, every idea, everything you do. So how do you find and test great questions? Well, one is ask the question. Then watch what happens in the next 4 seconds. It's the 4-second test. If the room goes quiet and then somebody says, hang on, you're holding on to a really great question. We need a second here. That pause in the sound of the person arriving somewhere, they had not expected to show up. You just unleashed a great question. If someone answers a question immediately and confidently, the question isn't that great. A fast answer means you aimed where the team has already been and they're just reciting. I threw away hundreds that, they got down to the question that didn't have any impact, but I had to whittle down all those to get to the really great questions that caused impact. Now let's put this to practice. Take a decision you're facing this month, and let's give it 90 minutes. This is a 90-minute exercise. Carve out the time in your calendar. Start with whichever of the 3 you are least comfortable with. Who, what, or how. Find a question. Take a question at random, right? And if you have the card deck, just pull one out. We'll talk here in a little bit about how you can actually get a digital version of the questions to make it easier. Do not hunt for one you like, because the one you like is the one you probably have already answered. Set a timer for 30 minutes and write down every idea that question produces. No judging, no editing, just quantity, bulk. You want to generate as many answers to that. Then do the same thing with a question aimed at your customer, and again with one aimed at your product. When you've worked through all 3, read back over everything, figure out some voting mechanism, or you can hop on over and read about how to rank your ideas over in the show notes over at philmckinney.com. And what you want to do is you want to pick the best 3 ideas to start on and then do something. Take those ideas and go forward with them. Now, this is how you run it on your own. This is solo, 90 minutes. You can be in your studio, sitting at your desk, sitting at the kitchen table. Do this. This is your exercise to try to uncover. Now, if you don't get a lot of great ideas, keep track of it by question, by card. And then next time, pull a different card of a who, what, and how, and keep cycling through. But that's how you run it on your own. If you would rather do it with a team, there's a second version of this exercise designed for groups of 4 to 6 people. Now, both are written out step by step over at killerquestions.com. That's a landing page I have, talks about the killer questions, gives you some sample exercises of how to do this individually and how to do this with teams. So you're not working from memory. You don't have to try to write down everything. If you're listening to this podcast or watching this as a YouTube video, just hop on over philmckinney.com and you will find it. Now, you can buy the physical card decks over at innovation.tools if you want. Now, over innovation.tools, we are announcing it here today. We've had the printed card deck out, I'm going to say 10 years since we put out the original card decks, and those are available. But I've heard from a number of you, particularly those not in the US, that international for shipping and postage and all that can get pretty pricey for the cards. So today we are announcing a digital download PDF of the entire card deck. You can run this on your phone, your tablet, your PC. And that's all available over at innovation.tools, which is our electronic store. You can also find out more information about the digital download and the format and how does it work over at killerquestions.com, which is the landing page specifically for the killer questions. Now, what I'd like to hear is if you're running those exercises is of the questions, send me the question that worked best for you. How many ideas did you get from it? Don't reveal anything confidential, but how many ideas did you get from it? Also, I'm always on the search for new questions for Volume 2. This is Volume 1. Says so right on the bottom of the front of the box that this is Volume 1. Volume 2, I'm always on the search for new questions. And if you've got a question that you've used that really you think fits, send it my way. Send your suggestions, and you never know. I might include them in a future version of the killer questions. Now, this closes out the 3-part series on questions. And if you've come in at the end, part 1 is about why you cannot stop yourself from answering a question. And then part 2 is about how a single word, the wording of a question, can steer the answer you get back. So wording and showing the anatomy of a question, that was part 2. You want to hop over and watch those if you got to this point in part 3. Now, the next episode that's coming up on the podcast is around abductive thinking. Deduction hands you a conclusion you can prove. Induction hands you a pattern you can literally bet on. Abduction is what you reach for when you have neither and still have to make a decision, which is, face it, most of the time. It's how a doctor arrives at a diagnosis when he doesn't have complete test results. And it is how most real innovation actually happens. Subscribe wherever you watch or listen, and you will get that when it lands the next episode, and you're not going to want to miss it. With that, we're going to talk to you next week. Bye-bye.